So I am Kurt Buehler. I'm looking forward to talking with you today about data literacy. And to help me talk about this today are these individuals known as the data goblins. If you're not familiar with them yet, if there's one thing I can promise, it's that by the end of this talk, you will be. Now, to start off with, we are all trying to get somewhere. And where is that place? Well, that place is known as Insight Island. It's this mythical place where data turns into business value. And in order to get there, we have to make a perilous journey, quite an adventure, in fact, crossing a lot of dangerous locations on the way. This is why we make data solutions, in order to ford the sea of data, which is plentiful enough. But when it comes to our data solutions, it doesn't matter at the end of the day if our solutions follow visual best practices, if they're protected and performant, if they're predictive and powerful. Because if users don't understand it or the data behind it, they won't use it. It will take them nowhere, and the users will jump ship and swim. But they risk being left behind. And as the sea of data churns violently and coldly, they might drown. So to stay afloat, what we need is data literacy, because in modern business and society, data literacy is really essential. But what is data literacy exactly, and how do we improve it in our organization? This is a lot to unpack, and it's what we're going to try to do together in the talk today. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what data literacy is and the impact it has on our organization. We'll try to define data literacy in the simplest terms as our ability to read, interpret, and use data in a decision-making context. We'll then look at a practical example of the kind of impact data literacy can have by taking a deep dive on a specific business case of a sales compensation plan or a sales bonus plan, and how data literacy can make or break such a project. Last, we'll try to address how data literacy challenges arise in this first part of the presentation. This is a very difficult and nuanced subject because at the end of the day, as you'll see, data literacy is all about people. And as people, we all differ in many ways. We differ in our education of data and data-related concepts, how we use data to engage with the world around us in both our personal and professional lives, and how we use that data to make decisions, again, in our personal and professional lives. But the bottom line is that what we've been observing in the last decades, the data skills that are required for the average person to be successful in their role has been increasing exponentially. But unfortunately, in many organizations, the average data skills of an employee has not been increasing at the same rate to keep up. What this is doing is it's creating a data literacy gap. This is a problem not only because it means that we're being less productive and less effective as a whole in our organization, but sometimes more importantly, people are being cut out of conversations that they need to be a part of, because those conversations require knowledge about data and data-related concepts, as we all can relate to as data is becoming more and more prevalent in our daily lives, again, personally and professionally. So the next question we all should be asking is, how do we bridge that gap, that data literacy gap? And unfortunately, I have to say that there is no easy answer to that question because data literacy is such a challenging and nuanced subject. That said, however, there are things that we can do. Since I'm a data visualization consultant, I'll be speaking about some things we can do specifically with report design, for example, by making a good choice of the charts that we use in our reports and making sure that those charts have transparent analyses, so that users can really see the receipts of what's behind those charts in terms of the data. Things like master data mapping, calculations, and the raw data so that they can really understand how that data is built up into the final results that they see in that report that they're looking at, that they can understand it, that they can critically appraise it, and more importantly, that they can use it to take actions that are meaningful and relevant and that bring business value at the end of the day. Finally, we'll wrap up by talking about how it's important to invest in data literacy over what is known as data heroism, which is a more unsustainable way and an unhealthy way of working with data. But more on that later. First, a little bit about myself. I am originally from Canada, but I'm based in Belgium. I've been living in Belgium since 2012, and I've been working at Ordina since 2018, where I work as a data visualization consultant. I am very passionate about working with data. I find it to be a lot of fun. Passionate about many other things, like inline skating is a pretty nice pandemic hobby. And as you can tell by the sheer amount of goblins and fantasy things in this presentation, I am an avid fan of tabletop role-playing games. That might not seem so relevant, but today it is very relevant because we are going to do some role-playing. Specifically, I would like to welcome you all to our business. Whether you like it or not, we are all a part of the same business and not just a business, the business. What is our business? Well, we sell and ship adventuring supplies, the daily necessities like swords, shields, potions, all this stuff. We sell and ship these from coast to coast, and we're pretty good at it. Our company has been growing a lot in recent years. We're kind of like the Amazon of the fantasy world, let's say. What is our company? Well, we're known as Dumbledopes Equipment Adventuring Deliveries Incorporated, better known by our moniker DEAD. As mentioned, our company has been growing a lot. Things have been going quite well, but there have been a lot of supply chain issues recently. Our cost structure has also been rather volatile, so it's been difficult to get a grip on our margins. In general, we have a lot of data and a lot of difficulties wrangling that data in order to pull business value out of it and to think and act in a data-driven way. So what we need are some good actionable reports made in Power BI so that we can take that data and do something useful with it, specifically that we can make data-driven decisions and take actions in order to sell more products to more customers in a more effective way. Thankfully, we've already taken some of the first steps in this direction with our reporting initiative, and this is something that has been spearheaded by this individual, Clonk, our resident data goblin, and his team. Clonk and his team have set up our first centralized Power BI reporting environment focused on our sales and orders. This was quite a challenging endeavor. They had to fight a lot of monsters on the way, some really grimy ones. But thanks to the power of user engagement, really working and collaborating together with the users to define the design and the scope of what they were going to make, Clonk and his team were able to design some reports that really fit the business needs. That doesn't end there, of course. We faced a lot of other challenges, which is why we needed to set up some user engagement and monitoring tools. Because our biggest challenge that we faced so far is adoption. When we first launched our reports, we really struggled to get people to use them, to leave from the comfortable feeling of their existing reports in Excel and other tools, and to trust the things that we were delivering, but more importantly, to be able to use them in an effective way. But thanks to these user engagement, something that we try to do continuously, and the monitoring tools that we put in place, we've been able to keep this threat at bay. Every week, more and more salespeople are coming to our reports in order to make decisions and take actions based on the data that we present. So we're ready for the next step, self-service for data-driven business initiatives. We, and by we, I mean Clonk and his team, have really been data heroes, delivering some valuable business insights that have started to really get the business thinking. And this is where our story begins, because the business wants to continue with some data projects of their own. The first and largest of these, in fact, is the Sales Compensation Plan project. For those of you who aren't aware, a sales compensation plan is a bonus program for sales teams in order to incentivize sales actions that align with our company's strategy. So, for example, when we talk about all these swords and armor and potions that we sell, we want to set targets for certain areas of our company, like more revenue or higher prices, for specific focus areas where we really want to grow. This helps motivate our salespeople to reach those targets, which, if they reach in a specific period, they earn a monetary bonus. It's good for them because they get a bit of extra money, and it's good for us because they've taken the right actions to move us closer toward our strategic goals. The question is, however, how do we make a successful plan? And as you might be thinking, the answer lies in data. But this specific question is exactly what is on the minds of our sales leadership at the start of the year. Get together and there's a lot of meetings discussing, okay, sales compensation plan, what do we do? What does that look like? What do we need? Well, first of all, we need a good design. We have to come up with a plan that makes sense. We have to pick some targets, like, for example, revenue makes sense. We need to pick some focus areas that align with our strategy, and we need to make those targets. So if we're going to have revenue as a target, in order to set a revenue target, we have to do some kind of forecasting. We have to predict what might happen next year based on what we already know today. And once we have our targets, we have to then map those to the appropriate people, accounts, and find a way to communicate it to them in a secure way, and for them to regularly follow up on their progress, like in a Power BI report, to see how they're doing in order to stay motivated and reach their goals. So what do we need from the data to make that happen? Well, in that meeting or the follow-up meetings, to start to discuss about the things that need to happen to make this work. And some of the things that are decided is that, okay, we need a number of analyses that are done, a lot of analyses on a lot of different metrics. We need to do a lot of year-over-year comparisons to see, for example, how have our prices been changing or how has our revenue changed in certain segments. Then we need to really make our targets. If we're going to set targets for next year, we need to make sure that those targets are fair, that they're achievable, and that they make sense. So we need to do some predictive analytics. We then have to make sure that using our master data that we map this appropriately, and we use tools like Power BI in order to feed this data into a data set, present it to the sales community in a secure way so that they can follow up in a report on their personal plan and see how they're doing and stay motivated. Great. So we have an idea of what we need. Who's going to do it? Well, we go to the BI team. They go to Klonk and his team, and they're really, really busy at the moment. We got a lot of migration projects. There's a lot of consolidation happening. There doesn't seem to be capacity to support this business initiative. So IT is too backlogged to support, but they do agree to take the final target file once it's produced and load it into the data set, connect it to the master data, and decide to work together to define a report that the sales community can use. But someone still needs to support all the other stuff, the analyses, all of that. So who's going to do this? Thankfully, someone does step up to the plate. This particular someone, known as Stonk, is particularly familiar with the data that we need to use. They already use the market data that we're going to be using in our predictive analytics, and they are a regular user of the data in the Power BI datasets using Analyze in Excel. They also have some familiarity with Python and plan on doing these analyses in Python in order to support the project. So, great. Well, we get started. And the first thing that we learn is that we might have underestimated the amount of effort that's required to do all these analyses. Very, very quickly, Stonk becomes under a lot of pressure to produce results with very short and aggressive timelines. They really have to rush in order to meet these timelines. There are some corners that are cut, but the preliminary results, when presented on time, are really praised by the sales leadership, who can use it to make some decisions about where we want to go with this plan. So a few weeks go by. This is quite an intense period, but we make our overall deadline. It looks like we have a first draft of our plan. Let's take a look at some examples of these analyses and interpretations to see for ourselves what happened in this period. Well, one of the first questions that we had is whether higher prices should be a secondary target. As you recall, as we all know, our prices have been fluctuating quite a lot. Our cost structure has been a bit volatile. So we need to decide whether this would be a good point to have an impact in our sales compensation plan. So the project team asked Stonk, can you do some analyses. Can you do an analysis year over year of how our prices have evolved? And they ask for this analysis by our various product categories, also by customer, but they ask first for the products. So Stonk says, okay, no problem. And this is the first graph that Stonk provides, a violin plot. It's very quickly rejected. The project team shoots Stonk an email back saying, no, this is too complicated. Just we want to know if the prices have increased or decreased. Just send something simple. So Stonk quickly whips up a slope chart to show that the prices have decreased. They look at it, but again, quite quickly a response comes by saying, hey, this isn't the most useful way of looking at the data. It's a bit misleading. The axis doesn't start at 0. That slope looks a lot steeper than it would be in reality. Just give a normal chart. Just give a bar chart. So Stonk does exactly that. Quickly produces a bar chart to show the price, typical price in 2019 versus 2020 on the right. But they say, okay, but this isn't the most effective way of looking at the data. Can't we just look at the delta between the 2 years? And this is just not so efficient. But that's exactly what Stonk decides to do. So just deducts the 2 years and shows that, for example, for our potions and scrolls, the typical price has dropped by about 4.7%. So they decide to go with this chart for the analysis and to repeat this for all of our products across all of our customers in order to really get a sense for how our prices have changed in the last year and also beyond. Next, we want to know whether we can actually forecast the next year, in this case 2021, with historical and market data. We are for sure going to be using revenue as one of our targets, so we need to make a revenue target. We need to make a forecast. So they ask Stonk to use the market data, which we've acquired, and our own historical actuals to put together a forecast. Stonk is really excited by this. They've always wanted to do predictive analytics, but it was quite a challenge. It was a bit aggressive in terms of a timeline, but they're really excited to show some preliminary results, and this is what they show. The forecast by month is in red, the dotted line, and the gray lines behind it are the actuals, the historical actuals. The project team has a rather lengthy discussion about this forecast. They feel like it is rather conservative, but given the supply chain challenges that we've been facing recently, they think, it could make sense. So they decide to use this as a basis and do some manual adjustments with our wins and losses in order to come to a base point for each customer of a target that we could use for revenue. So they ask Stonk to repeat this analysis, this forecast per customer, by doing the forecast for each of the accounts and then exporting it in Excel and sending it to them so that they, with a few account managers, can do some manual adjustments based on our known opportunities. And then they will send it back to Stonk, who will consolidate all of those files and put together the final revenue target file. So where do we stand? Well, so far we've defined 2 targets. We're going to first have revenue as a target, and second, we want to increase our prices by on average 5%. Next, we have done some predictive analytics to come up with an objective basis of what our revenue targets will be based on our historical actuals as well as some market data that we have acquired. So seem to be moving in the right direction, right? So what's the next thing? Well, we need to take these targets, which we started to make, and we have to map them to each of the respective salespeople and accounts using our master data. This is something that doesn't take Stonk too long compared to the whole exercise in predictive analytics. It's quite straightforward because our master data is not so complicated. We just have a number of accounts that are mapped to salespeople, and these accounts are grouped up into various key customer groups. And this is the level where we set our targets. So in this case, person 1, 2, and 3 each have the same target for this key customer, and they are working together as a team in order to achieve that target, which they individually are compensated for if they achieve it. So Stonk does this mapping exercise, and HR then takes that target file and splits it out by salesperson and sends it in Excel to each of the salespeople at the beginning of the year, telling them in a formal letter, this is your target, this is your sales compensation plan. We then provide that same file up through to the IT team, who does, as agreed, load that file into the dataset in Power BI, connecting it with our master data, putting together the right developments to create a report with some measures to compare it to the actuals so that salespeople can go to that report every day and see how they're progressing, how they're tracking toward that target with the actuals. So where we're at now is HR has distributed this final target file for each salesperson to them at the beginning of the year, but they will be able to follow up on the progress toward their target throughout the year in a Power BI report. So looks like we're ready. At the end of these weeks, it was a pretty intense few weeks, but we are ready to embark our sales compensation plan. Our sales leadership really feels like this is going to be one of the things that helps get us closer to that coveted insight island. But what we don't realize is that there is something looming in the background behind us in the dark, watching and waiting. And that is the threat of data literacy. So how does it go? Well, to put it lightly, it was a rocky start, to say the least. But a more honest answer, the first payout period was nothing short of a disaster. There were extreme discrepancies by the end of the period between what people saw in Power BI and what they saw in their Excel file that they were given at the beginning of the year. On top of that, there are a lot of results that the project team themselves cannot really easily explain. Some people walk away with a massive payout and other people walk away with nothing. The quota just doesn't seem very fair, and it feels like a black box process where a lot of people are frustrated and sales are spending more time doing analyses and validations of their bonus at the end of the payout period than actually doing sales actions to close out that period. In fact, what happened was the exact opposite of what we set out to do in the first place. We damaged the credibility of our sales leadership and hurt the motivation of our sales teams. Plan failed. But what happened? What exactly went wrong here in this story? Well, that's exactly the question that the sales leadership ask. And it's quite upsetting indeed. So they ask Klonk and his team to get involved and to work together with, in this case, Stonk, in order to figure out, okay, where did things go wrong? Was Power BI wrong? Was the report bad? Was the data set wrong? Was there a calculation mistake in Excel? What happened? Well, there's a lot of things that went wrong, not just from a data point of view, but also from a project management point of view. But they decide to focus on the data. So let's first look at the original analysis, and that seems to be really the root of where we started to go off the rails here. What could have been done better? Well, one of the first things that came out of this analysis was that in a lot of those analyses, the improper charts were used in order to visualize and work with the data. It didn't show the whole picture, so the interpretations that were made from it were flawed or lacking information. So if we recall, one of the analyses that were done was a year-over-year price analysis to see whether prices should be a part of our target. Stonk was asked to do this comparison of how our prices have changed compared to the prior year, and the first chart that they had shared for this was this violin plot. If you recall, it was quickly rejected because it was deemed too complex. Next, they shared a slope chart showing how the prices had decreased, but this was considered misleading, rightfully so, because the axis didn't start at zero. That slope line was a lot more aggressively sloped than if the axis had started at zero, and they asked Stonk to produce a normal chart type, a bar chart. The first result was not the most efficient way of visualizing the data. They asked to just see the year-over-year variance, which was the final chart that they used to do all of the analyses for our prices of our products by customer. So the reason why this was selected, and one of the main reasons why, was that this was indeed the most effective way to visualize the data, in a sense that we only need implicit information in order to read, understand, and interpret this chart. If we look at all the other chart types on the left, in fact, what we realize is that there's an increasing explicit learning requirement, meaning If I don't tell you how to read and interpret these charts, what's on them, what metrics, how to read a violin plot, for example, then you won't be able to read it unless you have acquired that knowledge somewhere else. Stonk just shared these results. This explicit learning wasn't required or to transferred over to the project team in this case, so they weren't able to make use of it. But let's dive into that a bit more pragmatically. Let's break it down. So if we look at this bar chart and we try to see, okay, what implicit information and what explicit information do we need to read and interpret this chart? Well, we need two things. We need to understand that the length of the bar corresponds to the difference, in this case, the difference in price. And our color is just something that helps us be able to make an interpretation more clearly, which is just used for conditional formatting. It's red, it's decreased, and that's all. There's no explicit learning that's required in order for us to read and interpret this chart. If we compare this to another one of the charts, for example, the violin plot, we see that there is a lot more to unpack here. So let's do that. The first thing that we need to see is something that we can implicitly understand. We look at the color, gray on the left and red on the right, and we can compare the years, 2019 and 2020. That's something that we can implicitly understand. We can also compare the proximity or difference in distance between a number of objects in this chart. So, for example, the different lines and how they compare on the left to on the right. But we don't know what those lines mean. For example, the dashed line being the median price. We wouldn't know that unless it was indicated or someone told us. It's explicitly learned. Also, one thing that we really see in this chart that really stands out is the shape. This is the distribution of the prices into groups. We see that the 2020 has two humps, meaning that the price seems to be grouping into two groups versus in 2019, we don't see that information. But we wouldn't know what that means unless someone told us that. Likewise, the symmetry, the fact that we can compare all of this information from the left and the right in order to really compare the 2 years and see how they differ in a number of metrics. We also have the relative size of this shape, the width of the violin. What this is telling us is the probability of a data point being in that specific area. In this case, the data point is the average price for our products sold per customer. So for example, we have on 2020 a higher probability of having sold a product at 75 euros in this case versus in 2019. So it is definitely the most complicated chart and it can be visually improved. But in fact, if we dive into this a little bit farther, we'll see that this is a good choice for this analysis and might have even been the best choice from the charts that were presented. But let's unpack it a little bit farther and let's also look a little bit more pragmatically. What does this say and what does it mean? If we look at the violin plot, let's look at each different component and address what it is, what it says, and what it means. The first two things are all about reading the chart, and the last is about interpreting it. Key elements when it comes to data literacy of a specific chart. The first thing that we see is the length of the violin, which tells us the range. What this says is, of course, the minimum and maximum, the range of our data. But what this really means is between what price range do we sell? What we next have are some dotted lines. These dotted lines indicate the third and first quartiles respectively. The area above the dotted line at the top is our third quartile, and the area below the dotted line on the bottom is our first quartile. What this says is it's the top 25% and bottom 25% of our data respectively, and what it means is how typical are high prices and how typical are low prices, as well as what those ranges are and how frequently they are occurring. We also have this dashed line, which is telling us the median. This is a measure of central tendency, which is suggesting what our typical price is. We can compare all of these between the 2 years by looking from the left to the right and comparing the proximity, but we also see, and this is something that's really unique to the violin plot, what is known as the kernel density estimation. Simply put, you can think of this like a smooth histogram which is tilted on its side. It's showing us the distribution of the data, specifically the probability density, And what this means is how probable prices are in each range, so that we can really see that there's a higher probability in 2020 of us having sold a product at 75 euros than in 2019. But that's all fine and dandy, but what does it really mean to us? So if we look at this chart type, what does this mean in the context of our story? Well, we do see when we look at 2020 that the data distribution is very different from 2019. It looks like there are two distinct groups of data points. These data points are the average selling price of our products, in this case, potions and scrolls, by customer. It seems like we might have two groups of customers where we sell at different prices. So we can actually test that by doing some clustering, and we do see, in fact, that this data does seem to cluster apart. We have a first group of customers where our price has actually increased, and a second group of customers where our price has actually decreased. In fact, our customers cluster by price, so when we're dealing with price in this context, when it comes to our data, these customers need to be treated differently, or we at least need to know this. Specifically, when we come back to our story about our sales compensation plan, remember that one of our targets was to increase our average price by about 5%. For salespeople who were account managers of customers in the first group, this would be something that's very hard for them to achieve because prices had already increased compared to the previous year. Whereas account managers for customers in group 2, if they had to increase prices by 5%, this would be a lot easier for them to achieve because all they have to do is backpedal their contracts of the previous year. So when we look at the data together, which said that our prices dropped by 4.7%, it tells us a very different story than when we see the data distribution, something which we missed entirely when we looked with the first visualization. So let's generalize. What can we learn from this lesson? Well, it's very important that we can effectively expand our chart vocabulary by being able to recognize when advanced data concepts can bring business value. Obviously, a violin plot is not something that's going to be a forefront in executive dashboards, but in a case like this, where data distribution can make or break the analysis, it can bring a lot of value. If we do decide to use these kind of charts, we have to really find a balance between the right chart for the analysis and the right chart for the users, something that's going to be readable. And we need to be mindful of how and when we introduce these new chart types. We can't just launch them toward the users because, again, if they don't have this explicit information in order to understand it, they won't. They won't look at it, or even worse, they'll just make some gut decision making based on what they see. We need to make sure that we use things like visual aids or frequently asked questions at the bare minimum to assist interpretation and avoid this gut thinking scenario or avoiding a situation where they don't use it entirely. Oh, this is the first thing that could have been done better. Klonk and his team, they agree that the improper charts were used. They missed out on this whole data distribution element, meaning that they overgeneralized a lot of the pricing trends and chose targets which weren't necessarily well motivated. Next, they noticed that there was a lot of overinterpretation of certain parts of these analyses, particularly when it came to the predictive analytics that were done. And this is because there was a lack of information in the visuals that presented this forecast, meaning that the project team could not critically appraise the analysis because they lacked the information to do so. So if you recall, Stonk was asked to do a forecast of the results of this year using historical and market data. They needed to do some predictive analytics, and this is something that was a bit of a challenge. They were under a lot of pressure, but they did manage to produce this initial preliminary result, showing the forecast line in red versus the historical actuals in gray behind it. Now, if I were to ask you a question, how can you assess whether this forecast is any good? The answer, of course, you can't. You lack that information. It's actually missing from this chart. And if we go back to the real story of what was happening, Stonk was under immense pressure in order to produce results. When they eventually did get this code working, they were really happy, but they did get a lot of numbers as a result. They already knew that the people on the project team probably wouldn't understand all these different metrics that were produced as an output, and they were only pressuring Stonk to produce the forecast. So Stonk included just that in the visual. But what they should have done is to show this shaded area, which is known as the uncertainty interval or the confidence interval, which tells us about the relative variance, or where we might expect the true value to fall given the assumptions that the data in the future corresponds to the data in the past, amongst others. This is what it would look like if Stonk had used, for example, the default parameters of the code that they had used. But when discussing this with the project team, they said that maybe they wanted to be a bit more stringent. They asked if there was a better parameter to use, and one option was to, for example, use a 95% uncertainty interval, something which is in academic research often used as a standard. This is what the data would look like if they looked at it with a 95% uncertainty interval. What we see is that by the end of the year, this shaded area becomes quite large. In fact, the forecast varies by about 240 million, or 35% of the forecasted value, which was plotted without that shaded area in the first place, by the end of the year. When the project team sees this, they all agree unanimously that they were a lot more confident in this forecast than they might have should have been, and they lacked the information to really appraise how confident they could or should be in it. One thing that's important to mention, however, is that when it comes to plotting this kind of data, it's important that it's disclosed. Remember, we need to provide that explicit information, that explicit knowledge. So if I were to show you this chart, you would be forgiven for assuming that it's done at a 80% or even 95% confidence interval, that it's a very tight forecast based on data with not a lot of variation and a very high sample size. However, this is actually just the same data as before, but presented with a 40% uncertainty interval, and it's an unethical way of displaying the data. Because a lower confidence interval does not make the forecast better. It's a false confidence that hides the real uncertainty. And that's why it's very important to disclose on the chart these kind of metrics. So what confidence interval is used, for example. So the overall outcome is that the project team agreed that the market predictions were a lot less certain than they thought, and they had a lot more confidence, false confidence, in fact, in the forecast that was produced as a result of this analysis. So they agreed that they might not have even used this as a basis for the targets if they had seen this information. What we can learn from this exercise is that it's important for us to be transparent with logic and analyses that we use in our charts. We need to be able to give enough information so that a user can critically appraise the analysis for themselves and the numbers behind it. We also have to speak up if we know that a presentation or interpretation of data is incorrect, and we do have a responsibility as data professionals to avoid the temptation to extrapolate and overinterpret our own results, no matter how interesting, exciting, or controversial they might seem. So we looked at that. What else could have been done better, though? Something that Klonk and his team noticed that was quite vocal, in fact, so it was rather hard not to notice, was that there was a lot of confusion and frustration about master data. What exactly was this confusion about? Well, if you remember, our master data was relatively straightforward. We have customer accounts, which are mapped to salespeople, and these customer accounts group up into key customer groups, which is the level where we defined our target. The salespeople were all sent their targets at the beginning of the year individually, and this file, this target file, was loaded into a Power BI dataset connected to the master data and compared to the actuals in a Power BI report, which was updated every day. So where does the confusion come in? Well, let's look from the point of view of an account manager. For example, the account manager of one of our bigger accounts, Nights, which he had a target of 56.5 million. 56.5 million, 56.5 million, 56.5 million. This number was really emblazoned above his bed at night. If he hit this target, he would get a pretty nice payout. So he was really motivated to hit it. It was really an important number for him. If we look at the Nights group, however, it consists of 15 accounts, of which he was only responsible for 4. There were a number of other accounts, 11 accounts, for which his team members were responsible for. But what he didn't realize, what had happened close to the end of the payout period, the Nights group had acquired another legal entity from another group that we also do business with increasing their group by one account. So of course, the master data then just aggregated as expected as it changed in the Power BI report, resulting in an increase in this figure by 3.5 million. The Nights group target then went from 56.5 to 60 million, but this is not something that would have been evident, this change in master data, to the user. He's just focused on his 4 accounts. All of a sudden one day he opens the report and sees my target is up 3.5 million. He sees that Power BI is different from his Excel file, which of course is static and which he received at the beginning of the year, and so Power BI must be wrong. He doesn't understand that the master data changed, and he certainly understands that process behind it and how it's being controlled, regulated, and how it works. So what could we do about this? How could this be improved? Well, things we could do are to create views and solutions to help make it easier for users to explore the data and see the receipts, for example, so that they can do drill downs and drill through pages to see mappings and calculations of the data. So for example, this account manager could right click and do a drill through on a specific customer group to a customer mapping page, which shows all the different customer accounts that are mapped to that key customer group and the figures that are behind it, so that they can explore and see how they add up to the figure that they're seeing, but also to explore the individual accounts so that if they also get an explanation of that, hey, this has changed, that they could really see the receipt for that and understand it themselves or explore it if they feel comfortable doing that. We can also do this in a different way with calculations. If confusion derives from, for example, how things are calculated, what we can do is to show on cards a custom tooltip, which just reveals how that number is broken down. So in this case, we have a KPI, delivered revenue, and we can really show how this is calculated starting at our invoices and moving all the way through our adjustments to the final figure, which we show on the card itself. This not only creates transparency, but it helps users build trust in the data and understand how that final number is calculated. So to summarize, we can use drill downs and drill through pages to see mappings and calculations, not just to get more detail. We can use tooltips on visuals like cards to show what's behind the numbers or a metric definition. But perhaps more importantly, for use cases like this, when changes can be very disruptive, we could set up data alerts or specific views to notify people when processes and dimensions change. It would be very useful, for example, for people to have a report that specifically focuses on changing dimensions so that they can see, for example, if there was a change in how the customer master data has been mapped, or so that the project team can, for example, decide to freeze the master data between periods to make sure that something like this doesn't happen, because of course it's not fair to the salespeople. So what could have been done better? Well, one of the first things was that there were not the right charts that were used for a lot of the analyses. There was some missing information, and as a result, the improper interpretations were made. There was also quite a strong overinterpretation of the forecast of the predictive analytics results because the project team lacked the information to critically appraise that forecast and thus had a false confidence in the numbers that they were provided. There was also a lot of confusion about master data because there was no transparency on how the customers were mapped or what kind of changes could happen in that process so that we could set up counter processes in order to, for example, freeze the master data between periods. Basically, to summarize, the data was correct, but how we used it and interpreted it was not. There were problems with data literacy. So if we try to define data literacy, a simple definition, as I mentioned at the beginning, might be our ability to read, interpret, and use data in a decision-making context. But of course, we all implicitly understand that data literacy is a much more complicated and nuanced subject than that, as the story reveals. A more realistic definition of data literacy is looking between the lines at all the other concepts that data literacy intersects with. So, for example, data literacy overlaps with mathematical and statistical literacy. For example, if we use figures like median. It also overlaps with digital and technological literacy because we often tend to engage with information and data in a digital way. We have also a lot of visual and information literacy that's required to use reports or process data, since it's presented in aggregated ways in charts and visuals. But perhaps most importantly, there's a lot of critical and analytical thinking skills that are required to think about the data, but also what's behind it and the context of it. These are just an example of 4 things, but perhaps what's most important to highlight is that all of this sits on top of a very rich and diverse cultural and interpersonal context. Data literacy is a complex and nuanced topic because it's about people, not solutions or tools or technologies. It's about the people who use them, what they use them for, and why they use them. And it's just one piece of the puzzle. If we take a step back and look at where data literacy is connected within our organization, we can see it everywhere. We can see it connected to other big concepts like organizational change management and business process complexity. So it's really easy for us to understand that data literacy can have a huge impact on our organization across many fronts. So the key message here is that data literacy, it is nuanced, it is complicated, and it's not an easy topic to address. But it has a big impact on our organization. So it's important that we do try to understand it, to measure it, and to do something about it when it becomes a problem. But let's take a step back. Let's think within our company. Remember, we're all in the same company. We're reflecting inward and trying to ask some hard questions. Where do our data literacy challenges come from? And since we have already established this is a very difficult and nuanced subject, how can we answer this question? Well, of course, it's got many additive factors. It's people dependent. If we just look at the people involved in this specific story, we see that they each have their own required data literacy level for success in their specific role. And they reach this level or don't reach this level through a number of additive factors, like, for example, education and data related concepts, their exposure to data, both in their personal life and professional life, as well as their digital activity, both again in their professional and personal lives, and whether they think about data in a critical way or about problems and processes in general. These are just a few things that are called out. Of course, there are many, 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 which add up to a level which may or may not be sufficient for that person to be able to achieve success in their specific role. But it's most important to know that data is ubiquitous in our lives, but the knowledge to read, interpret, and use it is not. And many feel that this is creating what is known as a hypothesized data literacy gap. A gap between the skills that are needed to work with the data in order to be productive, to be effective in our jobs, and the average data skills that are really being observed in our organization. What this gap is doing is it's causing a lot of problems, not only harming productivity, but creating unsustainability and creating a dependence on data heroes. Because heroes aren't born, they're created from data literacy disparity. That is also something that was observed during this whole root cause analysis. Is Klonk's team and even Stonk themselves came to the realization that when they were asking a lot of questions about decisions that were made in the project, why certain metrics were chosen or why certain data was used, very few people could really answer that question. The only person who could really answer questions or kind of understand this project end to end was Stonk. Stonk was the data hero for a sales compensation plan. Why is that a problem specifically? Well, it wasn't very good for Stonk, first of all. It wasn't very healthy. They were really working under aggressive deadlines and immense pressure. They were working over capacity and were really pushed to get a working version delivered on time. As a result, they really had to cut corners in order to make those aggressive deadlines. But when they did, they were perceived as a hero by the business and the project team. What this actually did is it created a scenario where the project team trusted them and what they were doing and delivering rather than critiquing the data or the data processes for themselves and understanding what was happening and why certain decisions were being made. What's worse is this caused a lot of practical problems downstream where Stonk became a bottleneck for future support questions and issues. When salespeople had questions about why things were happening in their quota or how it was calculated, even something really basic, it took them 2 or 3 weeks to get an answer because Stonk was the only person who could answer that question. So of course it was something really frustrating for the salespeople, which just added a lot more straws on the camel's back. Upon self-reflection, Klonk's team started to kind of realize, as well as a number of other teams working with data, that this was something that was really starting to become imprinted in our culture. That the way that we discuss data solutions, the way that we deliver data solutions, the way that we present ourselves as data heroes in the company, that was something that was building on this unsustainability and creating an idea that this is how we work with data. So it's something that we decided to change. Klonk and his team agreed that it's time for a data literacy campaign. They worked together with the sales leadership after presenting this root cause analysis to conduct the data literacy campaign in of itself. The objectives of this campaign was an executive-sponsored elevation of the data skills to improve the overall data skills of teams in general, to promote curiosity in data and solution-oriented critical thinking, not only about data, but about problems in general. We wanted to identify and disengage from data heroism in order to create more sustainable and healthy ways of working with data. This executive prioritization of data skills in our organization really became something that we tried to work toward in a practical manner. For example, we tried to track data literacy as a KPI in the organization using surveys, for example, to measure this. We tried to benchmark across teams and organizations, which we could then use to create a basis for professional development programs to help people elevate their data skills so that they could not only be more productive, but also more satisfied in the work that they were doing because they could do a better job. It's important for us to also remember as data professionals that we too can make a difference. Because if you see someone drowning, you don't shout, "Learn to swim." We'll pull up beside them, pull them aboard, and set sail for Insight Island together. Because consistent little actions can have a big impact. And this is not only true of data literacy, but many of the big problems that we face in our world today. And this is something that Klonk and his team really started to experience pragmatically firsthand. They started to do things like, for example, hosting open sessions about their Power BI reports, about other analyses, about ways to do analyses even in other tools, which they had quite high attendance to after some months. They hosted formal trainings on how to use the reports, how to even make some Power BI reports of their own in a self-service way. And they even did more light ways of exposing people to data. One thing that was quite popular is that they had a graph of the day. This started being a kind of newsletter that was emailed out to people in a distribution list, but they then just hosted this on the front page of their Power BI app, which showed a different graph every day of various topics, not just our data, but also just cultural topics which were popular in the current events. This helped because people saw that data could be viewed in different ways, exposed them to different ways of looking at data and presenting data, and also just something a bit lighter so that it could get a discussion going. But what's most important is that there were many consistent actions which had a big impact over time. So to summarize, data literacy, it has a big impact on our organization, but so can we. By making sure that we select, for example, effective chart types, which can really bring business value, and making sure that if we use things like advanced chart types, that we provide the explicit learning to really understand what those chart types are saying, how to read them and how to interpret them, so that we can really pull the value out from those rather than just throwing it into the abyss. We need to make sure that we have transparent analytics and logic so that our users are given sufficient information to critically appraise these analytics for themselves, and that we disclose this in a full way. Like, for example, in the case of the forecast, being able to disclose the uncertainty interval and say what that uncertainty interval really is. Perhaps most importantly, we can avoid the trap of data heroism to find more sustainable and healthy ways of working with data by investing in improving our data literacy between teams and individuals. because the time of data heroes is over. With increased data availability, data literacy, and data culture, we have a new hope for a data-driven business. Thank you very much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak, to all of you for your attention. If you have any questions, I can welcome them now. Otherwise, I can direct you also to a blog site that I maintain. I'm currently running a series about Tabular Editor, an educational series, and also just a deep dive. So if you're interested, there's more information there. And I also have 2 other recorded talks of a similar line on topics like data visualization best practices and report adoption.
Awesome, Kurt. Thank you very much for that. Do have a few questions.
Sure.
Okay, going back to probably about halfway through the presentation from Finn. Great visuals to engage people. What software did you design the presentation in?
The presentation itself is designed in PowerPoint. Some of the visuals are designed in Adobe Illustrator. I collaborate actually with artists in order to create the illustrations of the goblins. So those aren't illustrations that I make myself, but it's with artists that I've met and then commissioned to do those drawings. And it's a nice collaboration. So
works very well. It's great. Next question is from Fernando. What does ASP stand for? Now, Carl did suggest it was average selling price. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. So ASP is average selling price. Yeah. Thanks for answering it already.
Okay. And one here from Kirsty. Would you have been able to know that there were 2 groups just from the initial chart? I'm not sure which chart this is in relation to. Or would you use qualitative knowledge of the business to know how to segment it?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So when it comes to these kind of things, so for example, in the violin plot, it's all about I guess an idea, so a hypothesis, looking at the data and then thinking about it and thinking, when you're comparing 2019 to 2020 in this case, and seeing that the shape of that data is clearly different and asking the question if that difference is meaningful. Of course, to have that discussion, you need to have business knowledge. So it's a discussion that should happen with someone who does have that knowledge if you don't have it. And that can be a very nice and stimulating discussion. And then if you have the analytic skills to do, for example, a formal clustering, you can. Otherwise, you can really just dig into the data and look at those customers, for example, and dive into the details and try to explain it. And there will be patterns that come up that make sense. Like, for example, we see that, this account manager seems to have really, in all his contracts, the prices went up, whereas this account manager in all their contracts, the prices went down. So it gives you also ideas on different ways of splitting and looking at the data, almost in a breadcrumb trail kind of way, to push the discussion in the right direction and to give you the complete story so that you don't miss anything when it comes to making a decision. Like, for example, that our price target will be, increase average price by 5%, which then, doesn't take into account the nuances of the big discrepancies we have in our price distributions.
Okay, great. Another one here we'll have one from Fernando. The forecast chart should present a continuous time series, not overlapped by a month, shouldn't it? I think that's around about slide number 90.
Indeed. So that's also how it's typically presented. So in this case, it's because often business will ask, can you aggregate it by month? So in this case, when you look at the actual forecast that's done, you see, of course, if you look at it by day, it has all the daily variance. So for example, the weekends having the extremely low values, and then it's difficult to compare the year over year. So that might be why in this case, sticking with the names in the story, that the business is asking to see it by month so that they can do those simple visual comparisons. So, but indeed, would be the starting point, is that you look at it with a continuous time series. So, and that's actually the granularity at which the analysis is done. And that's also something that might be interesting to be transparent about, honestly. So good point.
Okay, he follows up that question actually with, what do you mean by see the receipts?
See the receipts. What we mean by that is it's to really see the data, the raw data, or the what's behind the data. So if you show, for example, I showed an example of the delivered revenue, or even something like master data mapping. If I just pull it up here, excuse me here. So so in this case, for example, let's say the delivered revenue, there's been a change in the way that the business is calling their revenue metric. We used to call it something like adjusted sales, and now we call it delivered revenue. And so people want to know, what is this delivered revenue? How do you calculate it? Does it include warranties? Does it include returns? So you can easily show the receipts of what's behind that in a number of ways by showing, first of all, how it's calculated, but also in a more granular manner by allowing them to see the figures that are actually behind that, even going down to a really detailed row level, so that they could see the transactions that are behind those figures if they want to go that deep, depending, of course, on the use case, depending on the context. So the idea of seeing the receipts is that you provide drill downs and drill throughs, not only for the idea of providing more analytical detail, but providing validative detail. So the purpose of being validate for users to do validation, but also to be transparent so that they can really see what's behind those numbers. You get the receipts of the analysis. That's the idea.
Great idea, yeah. We have another one here from Kirsty. Could you recommend any good sources for a survey, or what criteria to include in a skills audit?
That's a very good question. It's of course it's very context dependent on your organization, on their history with business intelligence and analytics, their culture as well, of whether this has been done before, how they perceive these kind of things. I can't give any explicit references. There's a few organizations, data literacy organizations, that have popped up related to data literacy. So they have a number of kind of, how do you say it, like ideative topics where you could look and see some examples. But it's something that kind of you need to look a little bit more at the history and the problems that you're facing, and to try to center the questions a bit about that, and to make it really relevant to the business users and what they want, what they're trying to do. And that will also help motivate a higher response rate as well, keeping it concrete. So that's what I suggest. That's what's worked in the past for me in my experience.
Okay. And another one here from Finn. Love the idea of graph of the day. Do you have any similar recommendations to get colleagues talking about data?
Yeah, in a number of organizations, a number of clients I've been working at since the pandemic started, I noticed that a lot of people share graph of the day or graph of the week about COVID, for better or worse. And it definitely starts a discussion. And as long as you keep that discussion focused on data, or even like have it be a part of a meeting, like for example, if you do data cafes or something like this, which is like a weekly or bi-weekly or even monthly calls where users can join in, and it's like an informal discussion about the reports or about a specific app or something like this, you can front end those calls with this kind of thing. Just throw up a chart, and it could be something really light and simple, like something pop culture-y, or something more like a COVID visual, and to discuss, why does this work? What does this say? What do people think? Just to expose them to different ways of working with data to make it feel more normalized, but also to start asking questions of the data, to think critically about it, and to see that it's relevant. So
Yeah, totally agree with that. Okay, I think there's one more question here from Wilfred. How easy have you found it to explain concepts as confidence intervals?
it's very hard, honestly. It's very hard to explain concepts like the hardest concepts to explain, in my opinion, are about data distribution. So, for example, like the example I gave with the pricing, confidence intervals, or even something like median, for example. If it's something that the business users have never been exposed to and they don't see the relevance for them, It's not something that feels tangible and concrete. It's very hard to use the right language to convey it in an accessible way. And that's really the key, is to be accessible with the explanation. You almost have this golden 10-second window where you capture their attention and you provide a little nugget of knowledge, and then you go from there. What I found has been accessible is to really front load that with a practical example that's relevant to them, or to use, depending on the person, because everybody kind of learns and listens differently, to use metaphors in some cases, or to use light examples that maybe everyone could relate to. So yeah, and then you can, after the discussion, you share like a figure.
Okay, Wilfred's got his hand up. Is there something you want to follow up with, Wilfred? Hi, Wilfred. No, okay. Any more questions from anybody else? You can take your mic off if you like, or you can put it in the chat.
I see that someone suggested, Kirsty suggested a source for some charts. That's a good place to look. There's also a few places on, for example, social media sites like Reddit, like Data is Beautiful is a really easy, accessible place to look. And then you can kind of use it as a little bit of a rabbit hole to go and find others. And there's a number of interesting ones also through the Financial Times, for example, has a lot of interesting charts. And a lot of the data journalism that's been circulated, that's a good avenue to start looking into charts that would be interesting or appealing. So
I've noticed the New York Times is quite on vogue at the minute because of the COVID chart that they created. Have you seen that one?
Yeah,
the spiral chart.
Yeah, that was there was a lot of discussion about that. That's always really interesting. Yeah.
Okay, Finn has another question. What is the one biggest barrier to data literacy in most organizations, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good and very interesting and heavy question. And I think a big part of it is change management, to be honest. I think there's a very deep, dark, intimate relationship between parts of data literacy and change management and the struggles that are felt there. And often things that I tend to see in concurrence is organizations that really struggle with or lack change management processes also really struggle with data literacy or lack data literacy improvement processes.
Yeah. A question here from Ruth about the recording. We did discuss this before we started, Kurt. Is this a YouTube channel you want to upload it to, Kurt? Is that correct?
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll host it with just a direct link on my YouTube channel, but then I post it on my blog site. So I don't like maintain a YouTube channel or something. I just post stuff on my blog site about whatever interests me about Power BI, and I host the talks that I give there after I've presented them a few times. So you can find it back there. I'll go back to the link. It's just data-goblins.com. So it's at the bottom here. And as I mentioned, I'm running a series at the moment about Tabular Editor, which has been a really, really valuable tool for me for working in Power BI. So more technical, and then maybe later this year, I'll focus on other topics like adoption.
Excellent. We haven't really covered external tools much on any of our sessions. So I've got an open question to everybody, actually. Is there any sessions or topics that you're really interested in? Please put them in the chat or drop us a line on Twitter or speak up now if you like. It's entirely up to you. It's your session at the end of the day. Okay, is there anything, Mark, do you want to add anything, or Chris, do you want to add anything?
My camera is working. Wasn't sure it was going to, so I switched to the web-based version. Nothing else to add really from me. Obviously, the question you raised there, Glenn, to the audience. If you want to contact us direct, you can do. Let us know what sessions you are interested in, and we'll try our best to arrange a speaker and session regarding that particular topic. Kurt, I just want to say those slides are absolutely epic.
Thanks.
I was just saying the other guys within Data Masterminds, I don't think I've seen anything quite like it. Phenomenal. Extremely jealous because my slides are normally, well, stop laughing, Glenn. They are terrible, in comparison, but these are phenomenal. And there was a lot of comments in the chat as well regarding how great they were.
Thanks. I definitely, a big part of it is this collaboration with the artists too. It's something that's it's really also motivates me to work on it. So because it's kind of a feed forward loop, so it's fun. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak. It was really nice.
Very welcome.
No, not a problem. As I say, you're welcome back anytime. I don't know. Is there any more questions? Glenn Legg. Beth's got one. This jobs really look like. I don't know what that means. What does everyone do on a day-to-day basis? Oh, sorry for the typos. Beth, I'm not sure what S jobs really look like. Do you want to retype that? Ah, right. Okay. I get you. Yeah, feel free, everyone, they say, to keep dropping into the chat. I believe it should still be open even when the session ends. But if it's not, feel free to get in touch with either myself, Glenn, or Mark. Drop us some ideas. And if there is no further questions at the moment, I think now's an opportune time to wrap it up. And obviously thank Kurt for a phenomenal session. Really opened my eyes to how good PowerPoint slides can actually be.
All about that. It was a great presentation actually as well.
Yeah, session itself, yes, everything fantastic. And I really appreciate you giving up your time to come and present for us. We really do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Awesome. So yeah, obviously everyone who was on here has already signed up with Meetup. Keep an eye out for the future sessions that we will be planning. We are going to be taking a break in February and March, and then looking to be back in April.
I've got something lined up in April, Chris.
There we go. We've got April
happened today.
lined up. Obviously March with SQL bits and everything going on. There's a lot going on in March, so we're going to bypass that. So April will be the next one, and hopefully we'll see everybody again. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Kurt.